Hi, bookworms. Welcome to The Best Book Ever, the podcast where we talk about your favorite books. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and my guest today is Nathan Van Coops. Nathan lives in St. Petersburg, Florida, on a diet that he says is comprised mainly of tacos. When not tinkering on old airplanes, he writes heroic adventure stories that explore imaginative new worlds. He's the author of the time travel adventure series In Times Like These and the Skylighter Adventures. His newest series, The Kingdom of Engines, explores a swashbuckling alternate history where the modern and medieval collide. Bookworms, you need to know that Nathan did not come here to play. He announced right off the bat that his book choice is the definitive answer to my weekly Best Book Ever question. I can't wait to hear if you agree with his assessment that The Neverending Story by Ende is the best book ever. Hey, bookworms. My guest this week comes from St. Pete's, Florida, and he recommended that I tell you about Tombolo Books. Tombolo is an absolutely beautiful bookstore in the Grand Central District of St. Pete's. They're currently open to a limited number of customers at a time and also offer curbside pickup. If you can't make it to St. Pete's, they do ship, so please do consider shopping online at tombolobooks.com. That's TOMBOLO books.com. This is not an ad or a paid sponsorship, just a shout out for a great bookstore. The holidays are creeping up on us, and I plan to support independent bookstores. From now on, all the book links in my show notes will point you to an indie bookstore. Please consider purchasing there if you can. If you're shopping for yourself, don't forget to check with your library. They can usually order the books you need, and authors still get paid when you check out a library book, so it's a win-win for everyone. Now, back to the show. Hi, Nathan. Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Hi, Julie. It is fantastic to be here. I listen every week, and I love this show, and I'm thrilled that I get to be on it.
Thank you so much for saying that. I have to tell you, the most exciting thing happened when you messaged me, because you were the first person who messaged me and said, I am dying to talk about this book. Can I please come talk to you? And that is my dream, that's the way this goes, is that people start saying, please, can I come talk to you about my favorite book? And you're the first one who did it. I was so excited.
That surprises me because I assume I'm like, she must get inundated with these all the time. People are like, no, this is the best book ever. This is the best book ever.
No, you've been the first one. So far, it's been me contacting people saying, what's your favorite book? Will you come talk to me about it? And, everybody has an opinion, but you're the first one.
Well, I'm sorry that the show's not going to be able to go on after this, after I prove that Neverending Story is in fact the best book ever, because it's really just going to shut down the show after this. I think that's
you're going to win.
It's definitive. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Wow. We got a lot of people who I think are going to fight you on this, but we'll see.
Throwing down the gauntlet.
Yeah. We'll see the case you make. I'm really interested.
I have a really solid argument for it, by the way, just spoiler.
Well, tell me, before we get into your well thought out argument, what is your reading life like in general, aside from this book? Or do you just read this book nonstop?
It doesn't ever end. So yeah. I do read a lot, and much of my reading is related to things I'm working on writing. Not necessarily craft books or writing books. I do read some of those, but mostly just things in the genre that I'm liking or things that I'm branching into. Right now, I'm branching into a little bit more of mystery and detective mystery specifically. So I've been reading a lot of detective books, some classics like the Spencer series, and actually one of my favorite indie authors, Alan Lee. His name's Alan Janney, but he writes as Alan Lee. Has a series called the Mackenzie August series. I've binged 6 of those in a row and just eating them up. So that's been fun. But I also read friends' books. I listen to several things on audio at the same time usually.
Mm-hmm. What do you like to listen to on audio?
Right now I'm listening to a book by Boo Walker, who's a friend of mine, local St. Pete author, who just wrote a literary fiction kind of book club novel called An Unfinished Story. So I'm listening to that. I just finished a couple of other ones. Where the Crawdads Sing was really good in audio.
Read that too.
Did you read that too?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought it was well narrated. And I listened to Trevor Noah's Born a Crime recently. I thought that was really, really excellent.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm listening to Red Rising, which is Red Rising is it's kind of a YA kind of adventure novel. I'd say Hunger Games-ish genre. So that's kind of like my action adventure read. But I have all those in process at the same time sometimes. Like, I usually have one or two going. So I have the literary fiction and I have the YA going right now in the audio. And then sometimes I'll listen to nonfiction too. I was listening to White for Jody recently and some other and sometimes I listen to craft books over and over again. On story structure, outlining, things like that. I love finding craft books on audio, which sometimes they aren't, and I get very frustrated.
I have a really hard time listening to craft books on audio because my tendency is always to underline and take notes in books like that. And so I find it a really frustrating experience. So those have to be paper for me.
Okay, I do like that. I do like having them in print and being able to outline or underline and mark things. But what I also love is podcasts about writing. Mm-hmm. And I feel like an audio book is a more condensed version of that, where instead of having to like sift through hours and hours of podcasts to find little nuggets of information that I can use, I can just go straight to the bookstores and then get all of it in one fell swoop. And I just think that it's a more efficient way to get writing tips.
Yeah, right to the meat of it.
Yeah.
Were you a big reader when you were a kid?
Very much so. I was homeschooled for quite a few years, from 3rd grade through 7th grade. So I had a lot of time on my own. I loved to climb trees as a kid. So I would take a book up a tree and then just hang out up there and wait till the other kids were home from school in the neighborhood. So to have people
God, that sounds
run around
magical.
It was fantastic. I would be up there. And I loved the idea of people walking by and not knowing I was there and sort of observing the world as it walked by and no one knowing that I was up this tree. And also people just couldn't find me, which was nice. Like, it didn't bother me while I was reading my book. So I read a lot of classics, Treasure Island, Count of Monte Cristo, adventure stories like that. Tolkien. This book we're going to talk about, Neverending Story, I found early on. And those were just like the things that kept me going. It was all these really kind of classic adventure stories, Scarlet Pimpernel, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. How did you find this one, The Neverending Story?
So this was actually fun. It was given to me secondhand by someone who had also gotten it secondhand. Her name was Julie, actually. She was a friend of my parents who was a woman who was actually working on becoming a nun. And she later on did become a nun. And then later on, I think maybe wasn't a nun anymore. It was kind of an interesting story. But as Michael Ende says, that's another story that should be told another time. So, but in any case, I happened to be at her house. I was a kid. I was probably 8 or 10. And, as you are at adults' houses, when you're a child, there's not much to do. You're bored. The adults are talking. And I think that she noticed that I was sort of just milling around the bookshelf. And she didn't have much in the way of kids' books or things that were accessible, but she had this book, The Neverending Story, and my copy was this 1984 edition paperback, but it has like embossed lettering on it, and it's a beautiful looking book. And she handed it to me and says, "Hey, would you like to have this?" I think she knew I was a reader, and I said, "Wow, that's fantastic." And then I think I started reading it right there, and then got sucked into the story as you do, and then it just kind of rocked my world as a kid for a lot of reasons. And then later on, it has been a huge influence on me as a writer over the years, just because of the way the story ends, which we'll hopefully talk about.
Yeah, tell me how.
First off, going in, I mean, pretty much everyone at the time, this was late 80s, early 90s, maybe right around 1990 or so, I was probably picking this up. So it had been out for a few years, and the movie had been out for a few years. So people had seen the Neverending Story, the movie, and I had seen the film. And I remember starting reading this story and thinking, like, they're spelling Fantasia wrong. Like, why is it? And it's because it's Fantastica in the book, is the name of this place where the story takes place, is in Fantastica. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, this is different. Something's, changed here. This isn't quite the story that I remember. And the first part of the story is the same. And for those who have seen the film, may not realize that it only covers about the first 45% of the novel. And then it's over like that. And then like the movie ends not correctly, in my opinion. And then it misses the bulk of the novel. It misses the majority of the story of Bastian Balthazar Bucks and what happens to him after reading this story. And I was shocked to find that there was this whole other element to the novel and that it ends completely differently than the movie makes out. And it has a completely different point to it. But it was and is this amazing love letter to novels and to books in general, to people who love books. And I mean, it opens in a bookshop. And then it's all about a book. And then inside the book, the book exists. It's one of those like book inside a book stories where like, oh, wait a minute, I'm reading this novel, but someone else. And it's kind of winks at the reader, even the author, even, kind of there's moments where he talks about someone reading the story of Bastian, and he's directly talking to the reader, not overtly, but it's pretty, right there for you as the reader to understand that you are part of this too. And there's a line, I have to find it, where it's at the end of Atreyu's quest where he comes back to see the childlike empress and kind of what was the point of this adventure I was just on, basically. And she explains that she already knew all the information that he comes back with. And he's like, well, he's pretty upset about it. And like, what was the point? And she has this line of, every human who has been here has learned something that could be learned only here and returned to his own world a changed person. Because he had seen you creatures in your true form, he was able to see his own world and his fellow humans with new eyes. Where he had seen only dull, everyday reality, he now discovered wonders and mysteries. That is why humans were glad to come to Fantastica. And the more these visits enriched our world, the fewer lies there were in theirs, the better it became. Just as our two worlds can injure each other, they can also make each other whole again. There's a whole discussion about like why he's not showing up, why he hasn't figured out that he's a part of this story. Why is he waiting? And he says, could it be that he doesn't know it's him and somebody else or not someone else we're talking about? And she says, not after all the signs he's had, he can't be that stupid. And like, it's also kind of like, I love that line because it's also pointing at the reader being like, you have to know what the point of this is and I think that there's an amazing theme to this story, which is, can a person become a better person through the act of reading a book? That's the question it asks. And it's a bold question, but it's such a fun question. And it's one that applies to all books, but it's very specific in this one because nothing happens to this kid, Bastian, in real space for him. He goes to a bookstore, he steals this book, he goes into the attic of his school, hides out, reads the book, and then goes home. That's the whole thing that happens to Bastian in this story. In his experience, obviously it's very different. But from everyone else, like this kid comes home changed in a different person by the act of reading this story. And that's the premise that this book puts out to all of us as readers. It basically suggests that, yes, you can become a better human being by reading books. And that's, I think, what I just love so much about it. And it proves it in so many ways. And for me, it was a transformative thing because I actually did become a better person from having read this book.
How so?
For me, Atreyu was the ultimate hero. Like as a kid, he embodied everything that there was that was noble and good about a character. He was my age when I read it the first time. When he was 10, I was 10. And he's loyal, he's brave, he's unflinching in the face of just the nothing, and he goes out and his friendship with Falcor I think makes the book. Bastian is really a terrible person. Like in this story, you see him, and that's where I think one of the things that the movie misses, the movie makes him out to be this sort of cute little kid. Like if you watch the movie, he's a cute TV actor kid. He's not unlikable in any way. Whereas Bastian is this, sort of, bow-legged, pudgy kid who's not even good at stuff. Like he even talks to Mr. Coriander and is like, they're like, boy, are you one of those kids who's like first in your class? And he's like, no, I'm not even like good at school. Like he's kind of, thinks of himself as useless too. And the main problem is he has no self-esteem. Because when he does get into this story, he starts to cast off things about himself immediately to become something that's a fantasy version of himself. And the whole process he goes through in the second part of the story is he first dives into this fantasy world, think this is amazing, I can do anything I wish, but by the end of it has to lose everything, every shred of himself, down to his name. At the very end, he's even lost his own name by the end, and has to go literally digging in the buried, lost dreams of our imagination to find some shred of himself that he can get home with. And the ending to this for me is so powerful, which is why I hate the ending to the movie, because they miss all of that transformation of Bastian, and they break the rules of the story, which is the stuff in Fantastica can't come here. And they have him randomly flying around on Falcor at the end and pushing his bullies into a dumpster, which is pointless because that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is for Bastian to transform and become a better person. The problem wasn't the bullies. The problem was his lack of self-esteem. So but at the end of this, the structure of this story, Michael Ende has constructed this world where it's built on our imagination. For people who aren't familiar with the story, I mean, I'm going off on a tangent. Maybe I should back up a minute and tell people who have never read the book or never read this or seen the movie even what Fantastica is. But the concept of Fantastica is it exists because of our imagination. It is the world of human imagination, where anything can happen there, anything exists there. Any story that's ever been told exists in Fantastica. Which, spoiler, is a key part of the argument to why this is the best book ever, because all of the other books that have ever been written are already in Fantastica. They're included in this book, because anything, and I think that it's fun, the scene at one close to the end where he's mining it's called Yours Minraud, is where he's gone at the end of his journey. It's the last stop, basically, where he has to find something about himself. He's mining in the underground of Fantastica, which is built on the things that we've dreamed and forgotten, in our sleep. It's part of our imagination. And I think it's really interesting as you read through this, how much of the elements of imagination the author has sort of taken, not just the good things we imagine, but also the lies. The dark side of Fantastica is that things that pass over into nothing become lies in our world. So that's the dark side of imagination. Mm-hmm. But there's also even just these things like this dream world that's underneath the surface, where you can dig into the dirt of Fantastica and find lost dreams. I just think that it shows the level of detail and world building that the author did to make this a cohesive place, and the rules that he built that work so well. The ending of the story, brings Bastian all the way back around to finally being a decent person. And he does take away the positive from this journey he's been on, but has literally shed all these, negative things he's acquired, and is a better human being. He's learned how to love. The picture that he finds down in the mine in Yours Minraud is a picture of his father in a block of ice that he has to literally melt out of the ice, because he has this cold relationship with his father, who's heartbroken over the loss of his mother. And I didn't get a lot of that, I think, the first time I read it. When I was a kid, when I'm 10, I'm like, this is an amazing adventure story, and Atreyu is the best. And Atreyu is the best, frankly. But I also, having read it multiple times, I think this time, reading it for this interview was the 5th time I've probably read this book, I'm guessing. And every time I read it, I get something different. But one of the things that I did get this time was a little bit more of an appreciation for Bastian, because I hated Bastian as a kid. He was the worst. So now I'm like, okay, yeah, there's some things when, he does get into the world and save Fantastica and names the childlike empress, gives her a new name. He names her Moonchild, which was his dead mother's name. And that's sweet. there are elements to him that are just, okay, that's a win for Bastian, that he loves his mother, and the most beautiful name in the world is her name. So there's things probably now as a parent too that I appreciate more than I did when I was young.
That was definitely something I wanted to ask you, because I see everything as a mom, as I'm sure you've heard me say many times on the podcast. And I can see, this is the first time I've read the book, and I can see reading it as a kid and just seeing it as a great adventure. But reading it this time,
Hmm.
the whole time, I just wanted to be a mom to poor little Bastion. Oh my God, that
Yeah,
kid just needs his mommy.
yeah, absolutely. And that's a big element of it is like him, and he kind of gets one in the story. When he goes to the House of Change, he finally has this like motherly figure who just loves him and like wants him to grow, and even at her own peril, like
Mm.
she changes and goes through the seasons of this love and teaches him how to change and grow. And then eventually he moves on. That's kind of like those were the scenes that I didn't appreciate as a kid. I'm like, oh, this is the House of Change part. This is the part that's boring. There's nothing happening. He's just being like cuddled by his, this like fruit giving mother. And I'm like, now I can read that and be like, okay, yeah, this is part of his
Yeah.
process, and this is important for the. I get it as an author too. Like so much more of it, I see what Michael Ende does in this, and even just how compact he is with scenes, that he gets through stuff that's like moving in a very short amount of words. Like when Artax, the horse, dies, like that's a incredibly sad scene. It's not very long, like it's on the page. It's just very short. And that's one area where I think the movie did something right. Like the scene where Artax dies is like everyone who saw that film in the 80s remembered that. It was like the saddest part of the movie. It's the swamps of sadness. Poor Atreyu loses his horse. It's even worse in the book because the horse can talk in the book. He's actually
Yeah.
having a conversation with him about how depressed he is going through the swamps of sadness, and then sinks into the mud and was like, no, you have to go on without me, and like turn around. I don't want you to see my end. Like, that's heartbreaking as a kid. You're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. I've never seen the movie. And I have to tell you, I spent the entire book going, when is Artax coming back? Because clearly you don't kill off the kid's horse.
Yeah. And that's another
Good.
stupid thing. The stupid thing the movie did was they brought the horse back at the end. They
Oh,
put Bastion on Falcor. He's riding around. He has this sort of montage of him flying over Fantastica and Atreyu riding on the horse. The horse never comes back. The horse dies.
no,
Like that's
no.
and art and that really annoyed me because of the relationship between Atreyu and Falcor. The Luck Dragon is so strong that
Hmm.
like giving him back his horse and then Bastion getting a ride around on Falcor is like that was like the biggest punch in the face to me. And I'm like, no, Bastion is the worst. He doesn't get
Yeah.
to ride the Luck Dragon. You know what I mean? And he definitely doesn't fly it outside of Fantastica, which is the entire point of the story. But the thing that I love that the book does, which is amazing, all of us as readers have been through this part of a story where we get to the end and we're sad because it's over. And we're sad because we no longer get to hang out with the characters. Michael Ende does this thing the whole way through the book, which is that's another story and she'll be told another time. Which
Hmm.
he'll give you a little bit of a preview of what happens to this character, even though you never see him again in this book. It gives you this little preview of what happened to him and what other adventures they got into, and it puts that seed in your imagination and lets you imagine it. And like he's like, well, this is where it lives. It's in Fantastica. It's in your imagination. Have this nugget and then go imagine that. And like gives you permission to just finish that story yourself. And then at the end, he does this amazing thing where Bastion has finally managed to like struggle bust his way out of Fantastica. And he's lost everything. But he's finally come down to the end, and it's very much sort of a Wizard of Oz moment where he's been carrying around his exit the whole time, or in the amulet he's been carrying around ends up being his way out, and he had to finally give it up. Which was what his whole problem was in the beginning, was he didn't want to give up all his wishes. He didn't want to give it to Atreyu, even though Atreyu was actually trying to like physically take it from him at one point for his own good. He like stabs Atreyu during this course of this story. Like he's the worst friend. Bastion is just the worst. And then he finally figures it out though. And he ends up at this, the water of life fountain at the end, which is inside this never-ending snakes. And he has to the snakes won't let him out. They're like, no, you can't go through to back to the real world until you've finished all these stories that you've started in Fantastica. They don't have ends to it. They need completion. And they're like, well, I can't possibly go back and do all that. And Atreyu says, I will. And he and Falcor go back and finish all of the stories that Bastion started. And for me, like, that just blew my mind as a kid. I'm like, what? Like they get to go and have all of the adventures, like all of them, that was like the answer to me as a kid. That was like, oh my gosh, this is the book. Like, it gives you permission to imagine this character, your all-time favorite character ever, in my case, Atreyu,
Uh-huh.
going off and having just like infinite adventures. And that for me was just the way I wanted every other book to end. I'm like, I don't ever want another book that just ends badly. I want this kind of ending.
So you don't like a tidy wrap up?
No, not necessarily. I like the door cracked. I like to leave the door cracked, that there's more that happens. And it annoys me. I notice like when I see stories where they do tidy things up too much. Like, for example, I remember one day I was watching the third Dark Knight movie, Batman, the Christopher Nolan Batman series. Like, he kind of does this thing at the end of the third one where he obliterates the last 10 years, where like basically says outright that Batman wasn't doing anything for the last 10 years. I'm like, why are you gonna do that, man? Like, why don't you just let us imagine that he's been having all these other Batman adventures in the meantime, and that now he's at the ending? I don't mind the ending, but don't like deprive me of my imagination. Don't tell me that he wasn't doing anything. Like, leave that for us to decide. One of the things that Damon Swade told me one time, that a story isn't so much us telling everyone, the reader, what happened. It's us building a jungle gym for the reader's imagination. That's what we're building when we write a story. And it gives the reader permission to go and fill in everything they want to have happen inside that story, because the story only exists inside your mind. Like, no two people will ever read the same book in exactly the same way, because in their imaginations, it's different. How they see it is different. It's their personal interaction with the story. It's their personal version of the story. And I think the Neverending Story does an amazing job of that, building this sort of jungle gym for your imagination that you can then go in and populate as much as you want. And it knows better than to ruin it for you.
I was thinking a lot as I was getting ready to talk to you, because you are a pilot, right? And I was thinking how interesting that is to be a pilot and a reader and a writer. And I was imagining what it would be like to be piloting a plane and looking down at this vast terrain below you, and how what you would be looking at would be completely different. If I were sitting next to you, what I would be looking at, I would be imagining completely different stories than you, and I have a feeling you would be imagining a really adventurous, from what I know of your books, time travel, medieval crashing, stories. Whereas I would be looking down at the houses thinking, she's plotting to kill her husband. And I would be imagining all sorts of domestic dramas. And so it's so fascinating to me that, it does not surprise me at all that what you love so much about this book is that, as you call it, the open door, and the way that you just get, because I would imagine there's a lot of imaginative time for you when you're up in the sky.
There is. And the reason why I started writing, a lot of it was because I got ideas while flying around. The first book I ever wanted to write was an idea that I got while flying. And I ended up writing it. It's my book, Faster Than Falling. Came from my imagination while I was buzzing around the sky over Baltimore one morning. Back when I was young, I used to be a traffic patrol pilot, doing morning and afternoon rush hour traffic. And I would spend, 5 hours a day in the sky, just sort of flying over the Beltway. And this balloon happened to wander by one day, just sort of floated by. And it gave me the seed of this idea of like, well, what if there was more stuff up here? What if people lived up in the sky? What if there was like plants up here? What if the sky was more like the ocean? And I went down this sort of rabbit hole, and then that ended up being a novel later. And subsequently, other ideas have come that way too. But like, flying was a big part, and of course, flying is a big part of the Neverending Story. The Atreyu flying through the clouds on the back of Falkor was probably the most memorable thing from the film back in the day. As a kid, you're like, oh my gosh, we're flying in the theater or on your TV, and because every kid wants to fly, kid wants a dragon. In this case, in the movie, they made him look like a big fluffy dog. But in the book, he's more like a lion.
Yeah, I looked at pictures from the movie before we talked, and I was thinking that is not at all what I was imagining.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be. No, Falkor, the character in the book, is much cooler.
Uh-oh. Is a toddler going by?
No, it's my dog. The dog is walking by making weird, like, huffing noises. You okay, Atticus? You okay, buddy?
Your
You good boy.
dog is Atticus?
Yeah,
Oh, of
another
course.
literary hero of mine. Atreyu and Atticus Finch were probably my top two literary heroes, and because Atticus Finch for me was this ideal hero, like he's who I based like the kind of father that I want to be.
Mm.
It's based on him.
And you have a boy and a girl, just like
I
Atticus
do,
Finch.
I do actually, and I couldn't be more excited about being a dad. It's just, and I'm thrilled that they'll eventually be old enough to enjoy the books that I enjoyed as a
Mm-hmm.
kid, and I can't wait to read to them, and especially books like The Neverending Story, because like I said, I just know what it did for me as a kid in my imagination. It just opened me up to this whole world of literature and just loving books, and um, even just the sheer cleverness of it, the idea of, oh, you can have a book that knows that you're reading the book, and like that's kind of a thing, or like
Yeah.
the whole meta aspect of Bastion interacting with the story, and it was just one of those tricks that kind of like you guys discussed. I know in Claire's episode you talked about the tricks with William Goldman, and
Mm-hmm.
The Princess Bride, and the whole kind of the way they break some rules in there. Neverending Story has that feel to it too, where it's like, oh wait, this is like we're breaking some rules of literature. This isn't just a normal story. And it as a kid, like when you find things that are clever and you understand them, it just makes your day.
And I found myself, as I was reading it, really envious of you and of everybody who has read this book when they were younger and then getting to reread it as an adult, because I thought this is one of those books that it's one of my favorite experiences when you rewatch or reread something from childhood and all of a sudden you go, oh, now I
Mm-hmm.
get that. Whereas I thought it
Yeah.
was entirely written for 10-year-old me, but there were layers of cleverness there that I was absolutely not mature enough to get. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought, what a fun experience it would be to get the experience of rereading this book at a
Mm-hmm.
completely different age, because you
Yeah.
would get so much more out of it and you could still have, but it wouldn't ruin it. There
Yeah.
are a lot of childhood books that you reread and you go, yeah, it was fine when I was 7. It's not that great.
Right.
And this is one where you could reread it and your childhood experience is not sullied at all.
Right. It
Because
just adds another layer.
yeah.
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 Yeah. How was your experience reading it just as an adult, not having had any prior experience with it? What were some of your takes on it?
I'll tell you, I started off because you told me in our initial messages that it really influenced you as a writer. So I approached it kind of academically at first, and I was really paying attention to the structure. And at first I
Oh,
thought it
okay.
was a book about Atreyu, and then I went, well, isn't that fascinating? It's really a book about Bastion. And I was trying to be very clever about it, and then I just let go and
Yeah.
just enjoyed it as a kid, as a rip-roaring, fun
Good.
story, very profound in parts, and I really loved it. It said so much about family,
Mm-hmm.
and I just
Yeah.
wanted him to go back to his dad. That always gets to me, parents and kids. That's always where my heart is. And when
Yeah.
he went back to his dad, I was so glad.
Yeah. It's a good ending. I think the ending is excellent. For the relationship he has with his father is very sweet, and the fact that he does thaw his dad out of the ice, through the act of having, kind of reached out to him, and then also he has that fun, quirky relationship with Mr. Coriander, the bookstore owner, who basically explains that any book can be this passageway to this Fantastica, and it's just it's different for everyone. And the reason why this is this adventure fantasy story is because that's what Bastian liked to read, and that's the book that would have gotten him in there. He needed a story about a 10-year-old like him who was the things that he wanted to be. It matched his internal need as a character, and it was this permission to be like, you've been in there the whole time, and all this other stuff didn't matter, and all you need to take with you. Because Bastian tries to take some of the water of life back to his dad. Like he's like, I want to take this to my dad. And he goes and like runs through the gate and like dives through it back to the real world. trying to desperately take this back to his dad. And he can't. There's nothing you can take back from Fantastic other than yourself and what you've learned. So, but by going through, of course, when he climbs out of the attic, he's a little bit braver. He's not scared of heights anymore because he once, climbed the forest of Perilyn. Like he's ridden on the back of the many-colored death. Like he's done all these things in the story that's made him a braver, stronger, better kid who, has learned self-esteem. So like it was like this such a cleverness of like this whole story was tailored to individual characteristics of the main character that he needed to go through. Like first Atreyu needed to do him to show how it's done, kind of, and then Bastian needed to do him badly, realize that wasn't the point, and then walk out of there having really changed and gotten the message of self, why he was okay who he was. And that's why I hate the ending of the movie where the bullies get thrown in the dumpster, because that's so not the point.
Yeah. Your description really hits on, I mean, you said at the beginning that Atreyu's always been your favorite and Bastian's such a terrible friend. Bastian was the one that I was really clinging to through this entire, because I've always loved the character who is flawed and makes mistakes and is kind of stupid in some places and has to figure it out and be humbled and be redeemed. And I just thought it was so cleverly done that everything he thought he wanted was absolutely wrong. And the person he wanted to be was actually Atreyu. He just didn't see it. He thought he wanted to be, Iron Man or something. And that's kind of who he turned himself into. And so he was the one I was really clinging to the whole time. Yeah. Same reason I like Scout so much in To Kill a Mockingbird. I always loved Scout because she was terrible. She was always disobedient and always getting in trouble. And of course I had a tremendous affinity for her.
Yeah, it's why you like Tom Sawyer, and like it's this, the ones who have a problem and need a little fixing. I still love Atreyu more. I would have named one of my kids Atreyu if my wife would have let me. But
I'm surprised you don't have a kid named Atticus.
Yeah, that was on the list for a while before, but we got the dog first. So
yeah. So tell me, what are you reading right now?
Like I said, I've been doing the detective thing. I've been watching, just absorbing new genres there. I've been watching a lot of detective films, like TV detectives, and that's mostly what I'm reading right now. It's just churning through, Robert B. Parker books, and I've been reading some Philip Marlowe detective stories too. And and just kind of getting a sample of everything. And I just picked up a Harlan Coben novel the other day at the bookstore. I'm going to read that. Just trying to getting a sample of all the people who have led the way. What are their voices like? I love Elmore Leonard too. His voice is amazing. He just cuts out all the nonsense. Just what would take me a paragraph to write, he manages in a couple sentences. So I'm just trying to absorb that. Oh my gosh, yeah. There's another one called The Friends of Eddie Coyle that I reread periodically, because again, it's same, that gritty, get straight to the point dialogue. I've actually been rewatching while I'm nursing a baby. I got a baby in one hand and a bottle in the other hand, so I can't read at the same time. I've been rewatching the show Justified, which is based on Elmore Leonard's Fire in the Hole, because a lot of the dialogue is that very specific. Elmore Leonard was an executive producer on the show, and I know that the writing reflects a lot of his style. So I'll just get little snippets of dialogue and be like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Like I gotta put that into my detective novel, that style. And I think a lot of it just comes from absorbing it over time.
It's interesting because it seems on the surface that a detective or a mystery novel is a very, I'm sort of envisioning just a square, this beginning and this end, and there's the good and the bad. But the really good ones, the ones that we keep going back to, are the ones where there is that open door aspect, in that my favorite ones are the ones where I don't know. There are several people who could have been the murderer because all these supposedly good characters have shown me a little bit of darkness, and all of these very bad characters have done a good thing. I don't know. Maybe they're not capable of murder, even though they're the obvious candidate.
What's your favorite detective novel?
Yeah, Inspector Gamache. I think I have mentioned Louise Penny's novels in every single podcast. The Chief Inspector Gamache novels, she does it, I think, better than anyone else. My expectation was it's a very closed story. There's always
there is the
complexity.
open door. The life changes around the detective. The detective doesn't change that much. They're the through line of the story. They are unchanged, but they affect the world around them. So there's chaos out there. There's calm, cool, collected detective in here, and that has an impact on the chaos outside. I think it's fascinating. I love the genre. I can't wait to write more in it.
I can't wait to see what you do with this. This is going to be fun to watch. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was really fun talking to you. I hope you'll come on again if you think of a book that you want to defend as strongly as you defend this one as the best book ever.
Do you have the second best book ever episode? Because that's what I can come back and talk about.
Maybe we should start
something slightly below Neverending.
Yeah, maybe I should reformat this and have sort of a face-off. I can put you and Claire against each other, Princess Bride versus Neverending Story, and have a face-off. And I'll just moderate.
Yeah, I would love that. That'd be hilarious. But yeah, definitely, I really enjoyed being on. It's a blast talking to you and chatting. And if people want to find anything more about me, they can. I'm just Nathan Van Coops. It's VANCOOPS. I'm the only one there is, so I'm super easy to find.
Thank you so much, Nathan.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. This is my blast.
Thanks for listening, bookworms. For more information on this episode and links to everything we discussed, please go to our website, bestbookeverpodcast.com, or follow us on Instagram at bestbookeverpodcast. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and you can find me everywhere as Julie Wrote a Book. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on whatever podcatcher you use. Reviews really help our visibility to new listeners, and we are so grateful for everyone. If you want access to exclusive content, including extra interview time with our guests, advance notice of the books we're going to discuss, monthly curated book selections, and more, go to patreon.com/bestbookever. That's patreon.com/bestbookever to support us. Your financial support really helps with the expenses of running this podcast. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you at the library.